Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this installment of the Hagen History Center's Spring 2021 Speaker Series. I'm Jeff Sherry, Museum Educator at the Hagen History Center. Our speakers tonight are Jim Wertz and Mike Jaruszewicz of the United Way Erie. Their talk is entitled The History of Public Education in Erie. Before I turn it over to Jim and Mike, just a few announcements from the Hagen History Center. We're currently closed to the public due to the pandemic, but we are currently working on new exhibits in both our new exhibit building, as well as the Watson Christie Mansion and the Wood Morrison House on our West 6th Street campus. We plan to be open mid-July this year. Our staff has created many blogs and videos that are available on our website at www.eriehistory.org. And we encourage you to check those out regularly. Jim Wertz is an associate professor of journalism and digital media at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania and a contributing editor to the Erie Reader. He lives in Erie, PA with his wife and 3 children. You can follow him on Twitter at Jim_Wertz. Mike Jaruszewicz joined United Way of Erie County in 2010 as a campaign representative and was named Vice President of Community Impact in 2017. Mike oversees our community impact work, which includes partnerships, grants, and initiatives. Mike is an Erie native who served as a Rotary Ambassador Scholar to Australia, a United States Peace Corps volunteer in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania before joining the United Way team. Jim and Mike.
All right. Well, first, I want to just say thank you to the Hagen History Center for this opportunity to share with you more about the evolution of public education in our community. I'm going to take a second and just pull up our presentation, and then we will get right to it. So I'm going to pull that up. Jeff and Jim, can I just get a nod if you're seeing the presentation? You are? All right, very good. So as I was saying, really appreciate this opportunity. And when the Hagen History Center reached out to us, we immediately thought of inviting Jim to this conversation because we were thinking about the Jefferson essay that he published in 2016, titled Erie's Public Schools, History, Challenges, and Future. In that, he makes a direct connection to the work that we're doing right now at United Way of Erie County with our community school initiative, supporting 10 schools throughout our community. So in our time together tonight, what we thought is we prepared a slideshow to accompany our remarks. And I was going to turn it over to Jim to share highlights from his research. I'll then talk a bit more about what we're doing currently with community schools, and then leave plenty of time for Jim and I to maybe ask some questions of each other and open it up to any questions that come through Facebook. So with that, Jim, thanks again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Mike. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk about this topic. I haven't had too many opportunities to dust off the essay since 2016, and so I'm glad to talk about it and to help celebrate what I think we're coming up now on the 5th anniversary here of community schools. And so it's an exciting time for Erie. It's an exciting time for education and to watch the evolution of the community schools strategy is so exciting because Erie's public schools have always been at the forefront of community education, and the community school strategy that's supported by the United Way is really in many ways a continuation of a legacy of serving both the neighborhoods, the residents, and the community at large. I start off here with this a quote from the Erie Gazette editorial in 1830, and back in the 1830s, there was a conversation going on statewide about public education. And the Erie Gazette was making its case because Erie already had, in many ways, a strong public education system for the era, and they were looking for additional support from the General Assembly. And so the Erie Gazette, the folks at the Erie Gazette, they knew what they were talking about. Knowledge is power, they wrote. Therefore, a general system of education should be adopted, whereby the children of the poor shall share the blessing with those of the rich. This will enable our children in the future to hold that rank in society which their privileges entitle them to. And that sentiment is really at the heart of public education. And in many ways, we've lost sight of that mission. We've lost sight of the equity that should come from public education as we've fallen into an assessment driven funding model, and we're constantly thinking about how the students score and the directions that take them, as opposed to the quality education of the whole child and the whole person, which was such a major part of that of the origins of our public school system. Here in Erie, we had public schools as early as 1805, and in the 1830s, as the debate was going on about creating a full-scale public school system, it's important to note that it excluded kindergarten. Also, another initiative that the United Way has been a part of, making pre-K, quality pre-K, accessible to all. But kindergarten wasn't included in the Free School Act of 1834. Secondary school, high schools were not yet included in the legislation, and so Erie used what power it had, what money it had access to, and engaged in what it called a pay-as-you-go option. And we should note that the population of Erie was about to soar in this time. There were about 5,000 residents of Erie in 1834, and by the time we hit 1900, we're at 50,000 residents in the city of Erie, and just 25 years after that, in 1925, we hit 100,000 residents. So that population boom made having a strong public education system all that more important. But with the establishment of these public schools, leaving out the secondary education, it required Erie to have what it called a tuition school. There was one here in the city of Erie, and there was one out in Waterford. And folks paid $12.50 a quarter to send their children there. Well, of course, not everyone in the city of Erie was able to afford that. And so a lot of students stopped going to school in the 8th grade. Now, over the decades that followed the opening of the first public high school in Erie, which was the original Central High School at 11th and Sassafras Street, which opened in 1866, the school district started to think about the ways that it could capture those folks that didn't get a secondary education because they couldn't afford to attend the tuition schools here in Erie County. And so there were a lot of adults who had left school too early, and a lot of immigrants coming into our community that either didn't have education or didn't speak enough English to get by here in Erie. And we see the largest influx of immigrants come in the late 19th century, mostly Russian and Western European immigrants. And those folks came in, many of those immigrants, regardless of age, couldn't read in English, couldn't write, and didn't speak English well. To give you a sense of how the school district was changing in that time, by 1880, there were over 4,200 students in Erie's public schools. And just 45 years later, in 1925, there were 18,130 students attending Erie's public schools. By that point, from kindergarten through high school. And the city employed 558 teachers at that time. It's pretty amazing when we think about how the community was rallying together, recruiting teachers from outside the community, making teachers from the folks that came through Erie's public school system, and taking care of all of those students. And they needed to figure out a way to take care of these immigrants and the immigrant children that were coming into the community as well. So in the 1890s, they started what was called an evening school. And those evening schools were critical. They provided basic grammar and language skills. They provided the education that was needed for these immigrants to become new Americans, to become American citizens. Mostly helping with language skills, helping some with civics education, helping them to have basic reading and writing skills so that they would be able to go out and get a job in our community. They also provided a lot of important life skills to native Erieites who had little or no formal education. A lot of these folks were the ones who had to leave school after the 8th grade, and those folks and others who didn't even have an opportunity to finish high school for any number of reasons. And as you can see here on the slide, 3/4 of the evening schools of the 1890s were native Erieites, and 1/4 of them were new Americans. And these life skills were anything from basic math skills. Later on, as we'll talk about in a minute, they provided some driver's education and other skills like that. But basically, they were the tools that people would need to get a job as Erie's manufacturing and infrastructure was beginning to take shape. When the evening schools started, they had an enrollment of 490 people. When you think about that in 1890 and the number of folks going to school at night in a single school, that was pretty impressive. And it really set the stage for flexible educational options for Erie's population and allowing the school district to establish a model for the first time that, as we'll see, and as it continues to do, it would replicate many times over the next century. The next big innovation in this education and this community education from the Erie School District came during World War II. The Erie School District was coming out of a terrible budget crisis following the Great Depression. We'll tap back into that in a moment when we talk about school funding. But the school district took it upon itself in its technical education programs to prepare more than 13,000 men and women to go to work in Erie's factories, many of which had been converted to wartime production, meaning that whatever they were making before, whether that was locomotives at then General Electric, or whether it was some other tool and die, that those were all being converted to the war effort. And because so many young men were either graduating school and going off to the war, or leaving school early to join the war effort, we needed folks to replace them in our mills and factories. And so the Erie School District helped to train over 13,000 people in those efforts in just 3 years between 1942 and 1945. As we know, in 1945, you had a huge collection of people coming back to their hometown, coming back to Erie after the war, looking for a place to settle. As I mentioned a moment ago, many of those folks had left school early in order to join the war effort. Now they were coming back home and they were going to have to get a job. So just 6 months after the war production training program ends, the Erie School District is looking at all of the opportunity that exists with the folks coming back from the war, and thinking about how they can help support them and put those folks back into jobs. And so in December of 1945, they begin the Erie Veterans School. This helped veterans learn shop and trade practices, machining, auto body repair, and a lot of trades, quite frankly, that some of these folks ended up passing on for generations to their sons and grandsons to carry out. And we see some of those names, beneficiaries of the Erie Veterans School, still at work here today. But they also learned draft. Go back there one second, Mike. They also learned drafting and plumbing and welding and skills that they would be able to go out and make marketable for a long time. But I think what was a really important piece of this Erie Veterans School was that an eighth of the people who attended the Veterans School were non-veteran civilians, people who were coming back to those to these community education programs to better themselves. In many cases, it was housewives, women who had stayed at home. Some of them who had gone off to work during the wartime production, but otherwise were stay-at-home mothers. Now they were coming to the Erie Veterans School to get their driver's licenses, to learn how to balance the family's checkbook, to do things that gave them independence within the context of their own families. We also had many immigrants coming into the community after World War II, and so those language skills became very important. And for the folks, the men who had worked in the factories for years and were looking to advance in their careers, they could come there and on their own schedule take accounting classes or take whatever kind of business and entrepreneurship classes they needed to help move themselves forward. And all of this was self-paced. All of these classes were offered in a variety of days and times so that people could come and take them when they had access. I just want to share with you the Veterans School slogan. It said, "Accept the veteran where he is. Find out where he wants to go. Give him opportunity to get there on a time schedule that is convenient. Allow him to travel at his own speed and provide the help he needs when he wants it." When I read that statement, that school slogan, it reminded me a lot about when the United Way and the Erie Public Schools were announcing their community school initiatives. It was about figuring out who the neighborhoods were around these schools, preparing the schools to be able to tend to the neighbors in the neighborhoods as they needed when they needed it, and to be flexible and to be adaptive. That's why it's called a strategy and not a model. And so we see these themes from community education throughout the history of Erie's public schools, reflected even today. Mike, you can go ahead to the next slide there. Now, of course, all of this takes money, and one problem that we've all heard about throughout our lifetimes here in Erie is the funding issues in Erie's public schools and other districts throughout Erie County. And the formal Erie School District was established in 1870 by the Pennsylvania legislature. And it began, as I said before, this kind of pay-as-you-go practice, trying to grow as rapidly as it could, trying to keep pace not only with the population at large, but with all the children that came along with those population booms as well. And so by 1895, the Erie School District has built 17 schools, including that first high school, Central High at 11th and Sass. That high school was prepared to hold 862 people, and most of the elementary schools throughout the district held as many as 450 people. So the school district spent money and extended bonds throughout this time, trying to do all of the construction that it needed to do to keep pace. And by the Great Depression, they were overextended, extremely overextended, and they were unable to keep pace with the bond repayment. And by the end of the Great Depression, the Erie School District was in bond debt, close to what would be equal to $100 million in today's terms. Sounds very familiar, right? And so they started a campaign to try to reduce their bonded debt over time. You can hit that next slide for me, Mike. This 10-year campaign to reduce bonded debt caused the Erie School District to go and close 7 elementary schools. A consolidation of elementary schools, not all that different than what we just experienced a few years ago, but they did a good job of reducing their debt. And by 1948, they had cut the budget by $2.5 million, which at the time of writing this study was equivalent to $25 million. A huge boon. But I think what's so important in this, and when we talk about cutting the budget today, it's always about loss. It's what do we have to give up to make the budget balanced? What do we have to give up to make it to the next year? And the school district back then continued their commitment to community programs, even though they were looking for ways to reduce their debt. They were not going to stop supporting the folks who had come home from the war, and many of those programs from the veterans schools continued through the 1960s, even as school funding continued to become an issue. So I capture that point that the school district, despite all of its problems, despite closing many schools, continued to reach out to the community and offer those programs that adults in particular were going to need in order to help move the community forward and make sure people had the skills that they needed, the marketable skills they needed to work in an important time. And so this issue of school funding, we talk about it a lot today, but it's always been a part of the public education system. In 1965, the General Assembly passed legislation that required the Commonwealth to pay a minimum of 50% of public education costs. It reached an all-time high in 1974 when the Commonwealth funded public education at 55%. But going through the 1980s and the 1990s, as legislators were more focused on trimming the budget and putting less public money into public projects, the school districts across the Commonwealth really suffered. And so by 2006, the legislature is funding education only at a 36% level. And at that time, they commissioned what was called a costing out study. And the costing out study said that if the Commonwealth really wanted to help public education, they would create a formula that favored larger, poorer districts and invest public money in those districts so that they would be able to perform at the same levels as communities that had high tax revenues that were able to support their public schools. That program was never fully funded, but during the administration of Ed Rendell, the schools were funded better and on a formula that did in many ways support and carry through public schools, particularly larger, poorer public schools in urban areas. And the school districts were all funded and in many ways continue to be funded on a program that's referred to as hold harmless. And that means that no school in that period was going to get less money than it had gotten the year before. But in 2014, the legislature says, listen, we're going to continue hold harmless, but we're going to use 2014 as the baseline. So now you're never going to get less money than you got in 2014. As the economy is changing and the cost of operation is growing, hold harmless to 2014 meant that many school districts, including our own, were going to get less and less money. In 2015, it was a funding formula was created, but it was never fully followed through because the funding formula created in 2015 only applied to new funds that the school districts were getting. And in this case, what ended up happening was that school districts throughout the Commonwealth that were already well funded, that already had strong tax bases, were in positions to apply for more state money and to get new state funding and increase their budgets. And school districts that were dealing with infrastructure problems, school districts that were dealing with lots of social issues throughout their community that were impacting the education within their halls, were not able to apply. And so it's estimated that in order to balance out school funding across the Commonwealth with that particular funding formula, as it's known, it would take up to 20 years in order to equalize those so that poorer, larger school districts would get the same amount of funding as more affluent school districts. So here in 2021, Pennsylvania remains one of 3 states with no explicit educational funding formula, meaning that they look at specific variables, the size, the poverty rates, the number of non-native English speakers. We don't have a formula that takes into account those specific variables in order to dole out funds. And also we continue to be challenged by the funding model for public charter schools. The way that charter schools are funded is that those funds come through the public school system. So in our case, the Erie School District is required to write out a check every year to the charter schools in our region, over $20 million. And they use the public school systems as a pass-through, even though the public school systems are being negatively impacted by the extraction of students from their schools into the charter schools, and the charter schools are not performing at the same levels as our public schools. And so there's a bit of a crisis and a bit of a tension that exists there between our charter schools and our public schools, not in every community, but yes, in our community. And the community schools, as I see it and as I see that model, the community schools offer us an opportunity to level that playing field and to offer some of the services that were the original promise of the charter schools, much of which has gone unfulfilled. And so I leave you with this note. Erie School Superintendent Herman Gross in 1949 was making a presentation to the General Assembly about school funding. And he said to them, an educational system that meets the needs of the community it serves in a satisfactory manner should be supported by the public with sufficient financial income to pay the necessary costs. Meaning, you know how much it costs for us to run our district. We know how much it costs for us to run our district. Help us to meet those demands, because education is like any other commodity. The buyer gets what he pays for. And so with that in mind, we should be all incredibly grateful that the United Way has helped make the investment in Erie's public schools with this community school strategy, because it is certainly enhancing the return on investment being made with taxpayer dollars.
And Jim, I don't think I could ask for a better segue into an overview of what we're doing with community schools, because I mean, you put it all in context, how important understanding history is to really planning for the future. And with community schools, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is help shape the future of education in our community. And I wanted to take just a moment to help those listening or watching to understand why is United Way involved in this work? And in essence, it's because it's directly aligned with our mission, which we hope everyone knows is to crush poverty in our community. But the approach to doing that is a recognition that we need to break the cycle of poverty. And to do that, it's through education. So as we were transforming our local United Way, trying to understand what are effective strategies to do this, all roads led to the community school strategy. We did a lot of outreach to other community school communities, because this is something that exists throughout the country. As Jim noted, it's really a tie back to the late 19th and early 20th century focus on community-centered education. And so there was much to learn from other communities, but a recognition that we needed to adjust the strategy to meet the needs of our local community. I'm going to provide some of those highlights of how it actually works here in Erie County, but wanted to provide that context in terms of why United Way is part of this work and really leading it in terms of the backbone as the backbone organization. So this really is just a high-level overview of what a community school is. Think of it as a hub in that neighborhood where we're identifying the needs that really address the barriers that are preventing students, but not just the students, their families, from being successful, and then bringing those resources in. And as Jim noted, it's very much a strategy. It's not a program. So when we talk about the barriers, we have this visual that hopefully makes the connection for folks that there are so many non-academic barriers that have a direct connection to student success. When students go to bed hungry, or when they can't sleep at night because they're sleeping on the floor, when they're trying to get to school in the wintertime and they're wearing a sweatshirt and not a proper coat, when they experience trauma in their neighborhoods or their communities. Just one of these things could prevent a student from not reaching their potential, but the unfortunate reality is that there are far too many students in our community that face multiple barriers. And what we're trying to do with community schools is start removing them one by one, so we're leveling that playing field so all students in our community can benefit from a high quality education, no matter what zip code they live in. So in terms of how the structure of community schools work, it revolves around a backbone organization that in many cases is United Way, and in our community is. And this work requires an objective organization with reach within the community, with the appropriate resources and expertise to help guide this work. Many communities where there's not a backbone supporting collective impact work like a community school initiative, in many cases, in most, it fails because you need that structure, you need that capacity, and you need that support. So that's the role that we play in our community, advancing this model, expanding to not just within school districts, but to other school districts as well. It's very much, we talked a lot about funding already. This is a braided funding model. So it's not all United Way funding supporting this work. We rely heavily on our community to pitch in where it makes the most sense for them. In addition, leveraging outside funding resources like state, federal grants, local foundations, fee-for-service supports. But corporate partners are a key piece of this because they provide the funding needed to employ community school directors. Think of these individuals as co-pilots to the principal. They're the ones that are taking all of those non-academic pieces of the needs that students are facing to bring them into the school. So they're not the tutors, they're not the counselors, they're not the after-school program providers. They're the ones that we work with to find the right partners in the community to come into the school to offer those services. In most cases, they're employed by a lead partner. And so while at a community school that's mature and fully functioning, there are going to be dozens of partners providing resources, support, services to meet those specific needs. But there's one core lead partner that really serves as that primary support organization, serving as a partner to the school. And all of this work is very much driven by the data. It's not guesswork. We're not hoping that what we're doing is going to have an impact. We're actually connecting with the students. We're connecting with the families to understand from their perspectives what are preventing them from being successful. And we're complementing that with the data that we've traditionally collected through school districts: attendance data, behavioral data, attendance data. All of this goes into a long-range strategic plan for each school, which we call action plans. So we're able to look at a school catchment area, review the data, and identify here the 15 different core needs that are preventing our students from reaching their potential. We're going to build out specific strategies for each. We're going to identify what those outcomes we're hoping to achieve are, what our indicators of success are, and these plans will then be prioritized so we know, hey, we can't do everything at once, but here are the 4 things that we need to try and tackle the first year of implementation, the second year, the third year, and continue to evolve and build our strategies so we're maintaining the level of support that's needed and responding as needs change in our communities. So the types of supports that we see in maturing and full service community schools include some of the items that you see on the visual here. Food and nutrition programs, basic needs supports, safe routes to school, or transportation safety, behavioral health supports, enrichment opportunities like arts and music, things that may at one time have been part of public education, but were pulled away, as Jim noted. We're able to bring back through this braided funding model to support our local students here in Erie County. There's more information on our website, and I'll have the link at the end of our talk today. But we're currently in 10 communities, 10 schools here in Erie County, 8 in the city of Erie, 1 in Iroquois, and 1 in Girard. And this might be hard to see for those viewing, but it really, what it shows is the robust partnerships that exist to support students here in our community. In just the few minutes that we have left, I wanted to talk a bit about impact. We talked about the structure, how we're going about providing resources and supports to students, but what are we actually doing and what are we getting out of that? It's a long-term strategy. This is not something where we see immediate results in terms of academic improvement, and that's consistent with what we've seen through other communities. But what we're able to do is start by removing some of those initial barriers. things like basic needs, things like connection to behavioral health supports or more enrichment opportunities. In time, within 3 to 5 years, we start seeing a growth in terms of academics, and then long range from 7 to 8 years, we'll start seeing improvements in those proficiency scores measured through PSSA. So there's a range of different supports that we're bringing into the school, from dental support, restorative dental care. We're seeing after-school programs in the schools. We're seeing additional mental health supports. We're seeing safety strategies like safe routes to school that you might be aware of. You may have seen recently, we secured a federal grant to bring case managers into community schools. So all of these things working together really provide the resources that students would have been lacking without the community school model. And just the last 2 slides are a focus on some of the recent highlights from the schools in terms of what we've been able to leverage from our community and from outside our community to support students. This is the 1920 school year, which includes the part where we were working remotely through as a result of the pandemic. But over 500 programs and services brought into the community schools on top of everything else that we've been providing. Close to 1,000 parent and family engagement events, hundreds of thousands of dollars of in-kind donations. And just the first quarter of this year, and again, keep in mind, operating during the pandemic, significant support brought into these school communities through the community school model. Over 14,000 student connections. These are efforts for our community school partners to be connecting with students while they're trying to learn remotely. While we hear so much about the struggles that they're facing, they have that support system in a community school model because we are able to leverage our supports to meet the changing needs. And also thousands of connections with parents, providing also additional needed support. So there's a lot there. There's a lot happening in our schools, and it's all interconnected with that evolution that Jim was talking about and where we are today. And it's an incredible opportunity for our community, if we're not already connected, to support the students that need us the most through an effective and proven strategy that leverages our resources to meet the specific needs that we know exist. To help improve our community and make that connection for the future. So with that, I know we're running short on time, Jeff, but wanted to turn it back to you to see if there were any questions that had come through that Jim or I could cover.
Right now, I have no questions from Sarah. I have a couple of observations, though, that you mentioned early on, Jim, the rapid growth in Erie in the boom years and how the school district kept up. I think that's incredible. I wonder if you've done any research, if that was true in other cities, such as Pittsburgh or Cleveland, say, for example, which is not Pennsylvania, obviously, but
Sure, sure, but as some friends back home would say, neighbors, but we're not close, right? I think it was. I think in this particular era, I mean, it's known as the progressive era. It was full of reformers and folks who were forward thinking, and particularly community leaders who were concerned about how they were going to help assimilate the immigrant communities that were so steadily on the rise. Not only here in Erie, but in communities like ours across the Commonwealth and in other cities across the United States. So I do think that the growth of the school system was probably pretty common in that era. What was less common, though, was the community-based impact and having all of the adult options, the adult education options. And in a lot of communities, you would see adult education options geared specifically at the immigrants to help them with English language skills. But here we saw that go much broader and extend to folks who maybe already had some mechanical skills, but help them round out their skill set so that they could get either a first job at a shop, or perhaps move up in the shop, and then adding those white collar skills to the repertoire as well. And I just think that's so special and so important. And you see the legacy of that throughout the community. I think we are Erie is a community of doers, and I think you see those skilled traditions continue to play an important role here.
And with the community schools, I mean, we're responding to those needs even today. You know, and when McKinley is a good example, when they were reaching out to their community, understanding what some of the needs are, that's what came back from a number of the adults. And so the team there worked in the evenings to bring adult education services in to make available to that neighborhood and to that community. So even though it isn't a broad scale necessarily across the entire district, what we're able to do is respond to specific neighborhood needs through the current model.
Mm-hmm. As a retired public school teacher, I have to say I'm proud of the fact that public education has managed to keep somewhat ahead of its time, and it's too bad that so much of it is just based on the almighty dollar. I also, Jim, you mentioned early on how standardized test-driven curriculum. And I recently had an experience where when I was getting out of it, it had already been going on for about 10 years. But we recently had an experience where some people believe they could go into the schools and help teach local history in the schools. And a teacher from the Mill Creek district came and spoke to those folks and said, "You have no idea, well, how much of my history curriculum is context based. It's reading a paragraph and answering a question, and it isn't the history that you folks took when you were in school." And they were kind of stunned by that. They didn't realize that was how that was going. So just that struck a little chord in me. We still have no questions. I'd like to thank you both